Morning, everyone. Welcome to one more edition of our wonderful Breakfast with Tom Fox. I'm very happy to have Tom and a very special guest today, Maria Kaur, Cynthia Catlett, my dear associate with Charles Rivers Associates. We have this program every quarter, so it's absolutely phenomenal to be able to count on Tom Fox giving us always the latest on the world of FCPA in the United States and all over, as a matter of fact. Very happy to have you all here. And I'm going to start by introducing Maria. Maria is a dear friend, very special to me. She is now a senior corporate counsel with Amazon business and that ethics team. Maria, are you in Mexico City? I never know if you're in Washington. You will tell us about it. You know, she goes everywhere, but Maria and I did a lot of work together in the past in investigations. She was a partner with Baker Hostler. Before that, she was with Arnold Porter, and then Hogan's and Hartsum at the time, always in Washington, D.C. I always tell people that when we work in investigations, it's a wonderful opportunity to make real friends, because we kind of get up at the same time, have breakfast, spend the whole intense day together, and then go to bed at the same time, stay at the same hotel. It's weekends, and we had this incredible investigation. And Maria, you became a real inspiration to me, and then she'll tell us why she became an inspiration to me. But it was almost like I always say, Maria, if my life has one subject that could be a Netflix series, it would be this one. It would be a Netflix series, because it was very intense. It was very touching, thrilling, at times dangerous. We were always with bodyguards everywhere. So, Maria, with that kind of introduction, please tell us why you have become a real inspiration to me and every woman that saw your work.
Wow, thank you. What an introduction. I really appreciate that, Isabel. And I would say, I think it should be an Amazon Prime series, not a Netflix series.
Sorry, you're right.
But no, Isabel is a dear friend, and the case that Isabel is talking about, I actually just mentioned to Tom and Cynthia that when the case started, I was actually pregnant with my third child, and I had a 2-year-old and a 1-year-old at home. And by the time we were able to obtain a non-public declination from the Department of Justice, my child that I had been pregnant with was able to independently use the toilet. So it just goes to show you how long these cases can run, how much work goes into it, how much time, blood, sweat, and tears goes into them, and you really do have to be dedicated for the long term, right? Because they're complex. And when we're in a situation where we have to, explain conduct that is violative, and explain, what we're doing to remediate the issues that allowed that conduct to occur to the satisfaction of the authorities, it's complicated, and it takes a lot of time, effort, and teamwork. And so it was wonderful to team with Isabel. But I don't want to talk about myself. I want to pass this on to.
And I know, what I wanted to say was, because you had this huge belly with Santiago. Throughout the investigation, everywhere we get on the plane, get on the van, go here and there, and there was Santiago, this huge belly during the investigation. But
I will add, Santiago is a very strong boy, and I think it's because of all the pão de queijo that Isabel fed me. I had a nonstop supply of pão de queijo, and the café de manhã in Brazil is unequal.
Right. Okay, before I forget, Cynthia, we have a wonderful interpreter here. You have to go into the interpretation room if you would rather listen to us in Portuguese. Also, those of you who don't know our format here, you are please more than welcome to send your questions to Tom in the Q&A. Please identify yourself, the company you're with. Our moderator will be Maria, and Cynthia and I are here also to help you with anything. You don't have to write your questions in English because Maria speaks Portuguese and Spanish. Right? Okay, so all that said, Cynthia, please.
Thanks, Isabel. Now, Tom, for those of you who don't know Tom Fox, which I find that very hard to believe because I think this may be our 7th or 8th. We're not sure. Isabel, do you know if it's 7th or 8th webinar?
It's 7th, but you know,
7th.
regardless of our breakfast with him, he is so known here in Brazil.
Tom is very well known, and it's what has made, I think, this webinar so successful. Tom is known as the compliance evangelist and often is the source to answer all FCPA-related anti-corruption compliance issues. So it's always a pleasure to be with him. I recently found out that he has published a children's book on compliance, so that'll be my next purchase on Amazon, Maria. And with that, I'll let Tom share some insights on the 2023 Monaco memo, as well as comment on the McDonald's case. But I'll let you speak, Tom, and then we'll be happy to answer questions.
And Tom, before you start, everyone will receive your white paper in 2 columns, Portuguese and English, on the McDonald's case. Everyone.
Great. Well, thank you all. So we are at the end of Q1 2023, and it's been 3 of the most momentous months for compliance professionals, the compliance profession, and CCOs that I can remember. Unfortunately, we've got an hour, and I probably need a week. So I will just tell you that in January, the Department of Justice completely changed the formulas for getting credit if you find yourself in an FCPA enforcement action, and you can now receive up to 75% discount off the proposed fine if you follow certain steps. That's the smallest thing that has changed, and that tells you how much has changed in the last 3 months. That's called a corporate enforcement policy. Second, Isabella mentioned the McDonald's decision. That, in my mind, has completely changed how a CCO, a chief compliance officer, and that means everyone who works for the CCO in a corporate compliance function, relate to a corporation. I'm going to save those remarks towards the end because 2 weeks ago, we had a momentous announcement by Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco and one of her assistants named Kenneth Polite. And they announced changes to the evaluation of corporate compliance programs document. That is perhaps the most significant document for compliance professionals because it's a Department of Justice document, and what it lays out is literally hundreds of questions that the Department of Justice would ask a company if they're under investigation. And what it gives you as the compliance professional is a way to benchmark your compliance program against government expectations. So we had the release of the 2023 evaluation of corporate compliance programs. I'm also got a white paper on that. I'm going to send that down to Isabella to translate for you guys because it's so significant. And so I'm going to start there. And it changed things in 3 key areas. The first was around financial incentives for compliance programs. And it didn't say you need to have them. It's always said that. But what it said was compliance professionals now need to really oversee the financial and non-financial incentive program within your organization. That's new. And it's going to ask you as a compliance professional to analyze your incentive program through 4 key questions. How does your company incentivize compliance and ethical behavior? Have you considered the implications of your incentive and rewards program on compliance? Who determines the compensation for compliance professionals? And are there examples of actions taken, either promotions given or awards denied as a result of compliance and ethics considerations? So basically, you have to assess where your program is, and you have to analyze it, and you have to implement it, and you have to monitor it going forward. Once again, these are things compliance has not done. Doesn't mean they're not done within your company. It may be done by HR or some other function, but now compliance needs to do this. Next up is the clawbacks. Now, we started hearing about clawbacks last year. So once again, that's not new, but it's newly inserted into the evaluation of corporate compliance programs. And the Department of Justice has a great phrase for clawbacks that if you're a parent, you might want to use this at the dinner table with your children, and it's called consequence management. So what are the consequences for failing to do business ethically and in compliance? And once again, there's a series of questions that the DOJ would ask to show that you as a compliance officer have thought through that. The clawbacks component is, I don't want to say troubling. I don't want to suggest that at all, but it's going to be difficult in many ways because number one, do you even have the legal right to claw back monies? So I don't know what the laws in Brazil might be. Here we would call it wage and hour law or employment law. But in the United States, if someone's paid a salary, not a bonus, but a salary, you can never get that back, ever. Once they are paid a salary, whatever that salary is, $50 or $50 million, that's gone. That you can't get that back. No state would allow that. There's no law that allows that. Now, bonuses are different. And so if you get a sales bonus based upon your sales where you've engaged in bribery and corruption, then you could claw that back, or a stock option. But it's going to be, I don't want to say, well, I will say, virtually impossible to claw back salaries. Most countries have similar laws, but once again, I don't know the laws of Brazil. Number two, how are you going to claw back? So do you have if you're business executives or senior manager, do you have a right in your employment contract to claw back monies? Some contracts in the United States allow that, but just because you have a contract right doesn't mean you can turn around and say, I want my money back. It means you have to go to court. And if you have to go to court, that means a lawsuit, that means an answer, that means discovery, and that means a judge or jury is going to have to decide whether that's legal right under the contract. So that's the next difficulty. And number three is, and once again, I'll draw on my experience from the United States because I don't know the justice system in Brazil well enough to know the answer to this question. How long will it take? Well, I lived in Houston, Texas, a huge city for Texas, 6 million people. If you file a civil lawsuit, not a criminal, but a civil lawsuit, you could look at 6 years before final resolution. And that's even longer than getting pregnant and having a child who can go to the bathroom by themselves. So it's a long time to get a civil judgment. And even FCPA actions, you can actually complete those in less than 6 years. So if the government says you have to claw back the money and you follow that and you file a lawsuit, you may not be finished before the FCPA action is over, and you may not know the results. So some difficult procedural issues around clawbacks, but this is now something that you must do. There's a couple of other things around the evaluation that I would like to highlight for you. And the first is, yesterday or the day before, I was interviewing someone and they gave me this great insight. We were talking about the changes to the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, and they are significant. And I want everyone to understand that. But that's about 3 to 5% of the entire evaluation of corporate compliance programs by size. What that means is everything else is still the same. So 95% of the things you were doing before, guess what? You still have to do them. And so it led us to come up with the phrase, to reprioritize your compliance program. So think of all the things that you do. You think about with a compliance program that you don't really think about. So gifts, travel, and entertainment, third parties, training, communications, ongoing monitoring, all the things that we talk about on a regular basis, those are now just as important as they were before. And even though I've emphasized these changes and how difficult they may be and how much more work you have to do, you have to still do all the work you did before. So it really, when that person said that to me, that was a real aha moment for me, because 95% of what you had to do before, you have to do now. So I wanted to, that's sort of point one. Point number two is you now are required to determine whether your internal controls are functioning effectively. Typically, once again, internal controls are not something the compliance professional looks at on a regular basis. You do look at them if you have a incident come in, or a whistleblower, or some information that perhaps an internal control has failed or someone has tried to override it. But you don't determine if they're functioning effectively. So now you have to do that, and your compliance program has to be adequately resourced and staffed to do so. Next is, who determines the salary of not only the compliance function within your company, including the CCO, but anyone who might be doing investigations for you. So do you work for a large company that has its own internal investigation force? Or do you have investigators in human resources? Do you have investigators in your internal audit function? You have investigators under the chief financial officer. Who's determining their salary? And where the DOJ is going there are the people being investigated determining the salaries of those who are doing their investigations. So you need to look at that, and you need to see who is determining salary. So for the CCO, perhaps it would be better if the board determined the CCO's salary as opposed to senior executives who might not yet be under investigation, but could well be. So you'll need to take a look at that. So this was a momentous change, but I really want to reemphasize there's a lot that stays the same, and you need to think about all of that going forward. So those were some of the most significant changes. This clawback question, I raised lots of questions, and I have to give the Department of Justice credit in the following. They have set up a 3-year pilot program to monitor these clawbacks, to monitor how companies are trying to address them, and move forward to actually try to use them. So all of the questions I raised, all of the difficulties you may have if you try to claw money back, the Department of Justice is going to take all of that over a 3-year period and try to formulate a way to do so effectively. And the last change probably, I don't know if it impacts Brazil more than it impacts the United States, but I know when I talk with people in Brazil, when I travel to Brazil, when I do business with companies in Brazil, there's a widespread use of WhatsApp. Well, there's a new part of the evaluation of corporate compliance programs dealing specifically with instant messaging. or they just call it messaging. And that means WhatsApp. And you now have to get that under control at your company. The department does not tell us how to do that, but you can't have people using what we call ephemeral messaging, meaning they disappear, for business. So text messaging, any of those, you have to be able to have access to those. And so typically in the United States, if I move between companies, I keep my cell phone. So I keep my cell phone number and I just move over. Well, you may need to rethink that policy now, and you may have to actually issue someone a company cell phone with a different number so that the company has access to that. Of course, if you have your personal cell phone, all sorts of privacy issues come up. Do you want people ruminating around in your cell phone? Do you have pictures, family members that you don't want them to see? I mean, you think of the variations, and they're endless. But the Department of Justice says companies, if people are using their own cell phones, bring your own device, whatever you may want to call it, companies have to have access to this. We had massive Securities and Exchange Commission enforcement actions in 2022 over this specific issue. And so many banks were fined that the total fines exceeded $3 billion on that issue alone. Instant messaging and banks' failure to oversee. This was not public companies, but it's coming. So you need to start looking at that issue and how you're going to manage that. So those were the big changes from the 2023 evaluation of corporate compliance programs. And now, of course, as in all things United States, it's just called by its letters, ECCP. So if you see ECCP, that means the evaluation of corporate compliance programs. And once again, I'm going to provide to Isabel for translation my analysis of the changes. So hopefully that will be of some use to you all going forward. And now I want to talk about the McDonald's decision, because how this occurred, sort of under the radar, and we have this major change in law that directly impacts compliance professionals. We typically don't get changes in the law around compliance. So let me give a little background. The state of Delaware in the United States has the most developed law around corporations. So almost all corporations, major corporations, are formed in Delaware, which means Delaware law controls them. So this decision came out of a state court in Delaware, and the court had previously said, and it's fairly well known, that boards of directors have a duty of oversight over compliance. And that's called the Caremark doctrine. Caremark was a healthcare case, and they were engaged in bribery and corruption with doctors, paying them to prescribe their products. So from a bribery and corruption perspective, a pretty straightforward case, and something that most of us are going to be familiar with. But it means that whatever your company is, you have to manage the biggest risk. So I'm from the great state of Texas. There was a company in Texas that made ice cream, and they were called Bluebell Ice Cream. And they were a beloved company, perhaps the most beloved company in the state of Texas. And they made great ice cream, and it was a family business. So the same family had owned it for 100 years. Well, in some of their plants, they slacked off on maintenance and, most important, cleaning. There was an outbreak of what's called listeria that got in the ice cream, and a few people died. So that's a huge deal when a food product causes someone's death. But the Delaware court looked at that case and said the board of directors failed in their duty of oversight because there was no food safety committee at the board level. And so what all of that means is whatever your highest risk is, you have to manage that risk from a compliance perspective. So for a healthcare For a pharmaceutical company, it might be paying bribes to doctors. For a one product food company, it's that food product. So Bluebell ice cream, it was Bluebell. They also had a case around Boeing Airlines and their 2 plane crashes about 5 years ago. Once again, the board didn't have a airplane safety committee. You might think, well, if you make airplanes and that's your only product, that's what you would manage. So Boeing had a huge penalty against it. These were not fines. These were civil judgments of cash that were paid out against Bluebell ice cream and against Boeing. Now, Bluebell is also a great example of what can happen if you fail in compliance and oversight, because 100-year-old company, they had to shut the company down for about 6 months. They lost so much money they had to sell. The family lost control of the company. It's owned by private equity in the United States. They completely changed the formula. The ice cream is crap, and I don't buy it anymore. And a lot of other people don't buy it anymore. So they really lost their name. They lost their business, and they paid out huge judgments. And the CEO was tried criminally. He was found not guilty, but he still had to pay a huge fine. So the consequences can be great. So that's the responsibility of the board. It's called the duty of oversight. What the McDonald's case said was there's now a duty of oversight for senior corporate executives, the same as boards. So CEO, CFO, CIO, head of HR, all of those functions now have a duty of oversight. And McDonald's, it's McDonald's, the hamburger company, and they had a CEO and they had their head of an HR who were engaged in sexual harassment and a lot of conduct along those lines. Well, think about that when your head of HR is having affairs throughout the company and sexually harassing women in your company. And yes, it was that bad. And it was so bad that McDonald's employees actually struck against the company for the sexual harassment, and franchise employees did the same. There wasn't sufficient training. Allegations of sexual harassment were not taken seriously. It was terrible. McDonald's board finally got involved and they started to clean things up, and they did do that. So the board was not sued here, or the board was not sued successfully. But the Delaware court said for the first time, officers now hold the same duty of oversight as boards. And the head of HR failed in his duty of oversight because he was engaging in the same conduct. So that's sort of point one. A CCO now is a new duty. But here's the true significance, and this really is interesting, and I'm going to tie it back to something that happened in 2022. What the court said was every corporate officer is responsible for their discipline. Chief legal officer, general counsel, legal. Head of HR, HR. Chief information/technology officer, technology, information systems. You name it, internal audit, chief financial officer, except two. The CEO has visibility across everything, but the other officer is the chief compliance officer. So this has elevated the role of the CCO to literally number 2 in an organization. Now you may say to me, well, Tom, our CCO is not even a corporate officer. They're a director, they're important, they've got a title, but they're not a corporate officer. Well, guess what? They are now. And so the pressure on the CCO has greatly increased, but also this gives the CCO and perhaps the compliance function an opportunity to explain to corporate officers, this is not me asking for more. This is the court saying, I have to have visibility into everything. So let me tie that to something that happened in 2022, which was the requirement now for CCO certification. What that means, if you're in an enforcement action and you sign an NPA or a DPA, not a declination, that's a different animal. But if you sign some sort of agreement with the government, this at the end of that period, whether typically it's 3 years, but it could be 5 years, the chief compliance officer has to certify the compliance program is effective. That's a completely new requirement. So it's called CCO certification. That was announced about a year ago. So when you put CCO certification with this McDonald's case, you see that the regulators, the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission have elevated the role of the CCO. They've elevated the pressure on the CCO, and they've also elevated the visibility the CCO and you as the compliance function must have throughout your organization. So that's a huge change. I think over time, it's going to increase not simply the responsibility on CCO, but the CCO and compliance, but also how important those functions are to an overall organization. It's not going to be tomorrow. You're not going to call me next week and say, Tom, we're ready to move the CCO up to number 2. It's going to be an evolution, but you need to start thinking about how does this impact my corporate compliance function? And if you're a CCO, you need to be thinking about how am I going to fulfill these obligations with what I have, and how do I talk to senior management and the board of directors about this new reality? So, like I said, Q1 was pretty momentous. Lots to talk about. I really didn't even discuss the changes in the formulas for fines and penalties. We'll have to do that a different day. So with that, Isabella, I'm going to turn it back over to you guys to see if there are any questions going forward.
A million questions, Tom. Thank you so much. This is so dense. It's a lot right here. Like I said, please, everyone, we're open to questions. We have about a half an hour of debates that will be moderated by Maria. Please place your questions in the Q&A in Portuguese or English. Identify yourselves, and Maria will pick the questions right there. But Maria, do you have any questions to start with?
I do.
Because now, I'm feeling the pressure on you because you do have this CCO, the compliance function for Amazon. So it's more than anyone here in Brazil, although this is a question I will ask Tom also. Please, Maria, the podium is yours.
Thank you so much. And I see the questions are coming in, but I really interesting discussion, Tom, and really insightful. I cover compliance for all of Latin America, which is, there's just some risk in this region, a little bit. And I think a couple of the things that you touched on are really relevant to the region. One of them you mentioned with regard to the ephemeral messaging and the use of WhatsApp. And I think this is something, when I talk to compliance officers and counsel in the region, I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we have in Latin America. You've got government officials that reach out via WhatsApp. It's so frequently and commonly used. And I know that under the new guidance, we need enforceable controls. We need to test those controls. And we'd love to hear, I think I'm probably not the only one participating here that would love to hear your insights on, how you mentioned the possibility of company cell phones as one potential control, but what are the kinds of controls that we could implement? We don't have that guidance in the memo. And then in terms of testing, what do we do to test those controls and whether they're effective?
So it's going to be extraordinarily difficult. One, and I really want to emphasize what you said, Maria, On the cultural aspect of using WhatsApp or other messaging, it's not as prevalent here in the United States, but outside the United States, absolutely, it is part of culture. And so it's going to be extremely difficult, one, to get people not to use it, and then two, sort of monitor it going forward. But basically where we are now is companies have to show they have access to that information. And that moves, if it's personal cell phone, then we move to an entire new level of privacy issues. I'm generally familiar with the Brazilian privacy law because it's in some ways modeled on GDPR. So I understand that. And I haven't quite figured out what the answer is going to be. But at least from the US perspective, you have to have access to that. And you mentioned monitoring and testing. That means you have to go out and test to see, one, are employees using messages that are being retained on their cell phone? Because that's kind of the first consideration. If it's truly ephemeral and it's going away, that's going to be a problem under the US law. I mean, the last time I came to Brazil, the travel agent said, oh, just, let me know WhatsApp me your credit card number. And I just went bonkers. And I said, I'm not going to do that. And Isabel had to tell me, oh, Tom, that's how we do business here. So, that's a difference. That's a cultural difference that I didn't fully appreciate. And that's the kind of thing the Department of Justice is going to expect. And then, but that's just step one, which is, are the messages being retained? Step two is, do you have access to those retained messages? So I'll just use myself as an example. I may have an ephemeral messaging app on my phone, and if I'm working for Isabel, she may not even know that. Why would she know that? How would she know that? I could tell her, but I might not tell her. So it's going to be extremely difficult, but it's really a two-step analysis. One, are the messages being captured on a cell phone? And then two, does the company have access to those, or can they get access? That's sort of where we are right now.
Thank you so much. I think there are a few questions that are coming in specifically related to ephemeral messaging. And I see one from Felipe Badia, who's with Goodyear, who I also know back from my days on working with Isabel. One of the questions here is, what is the expectation for blue collar workers, right? In terms of providing cell phones, this isn't something that I think is foreseen by DOJ, that we'd be providing the cell phones to production employees. So what's expected in terms of data collection from blue collar workers?
So that's a great question. And it allows us to talk about risk and risk assessment and risk ranking. So let me just pick on Ford Motor Company, because if I'm a blue collar worker on the Ford factory line in Brazil, I may be low risk, not no risk, because there's always some risk, but think about a blue collar worker and their risk for a legal violation. Now, I understand a worker on a line can get injured. There can be some other types of risk. It could largely safety, but also production risk. But typically it's not going to go to a bribery, corruption, or other white collar crime risk. So, and the same might be true on an oil rig. With Petrobras employees working on the rig, is there some risk? Always. But the risk of bribery, corruption, or other crime is so low that you may not have to worry about those. But the key is that you've assessed that risk, and you may have an incredibly large workforce. And here we can just look at Walmart. I think it's 300,000 maybe worldwide. Certainly Amazon is a huge workforce, but you're going to have the vast majority of those actually will be little to no risk. And so if they're blue collar workers and you assess the risk of a violation, and I don't mean a safety violation or something like that, but a legal violation, and you exempt them out from this and monitor that, and they don't rise in risk, then I don't think you have to worry about that from a blue collar perspective. But the key is that you've assessed the risk, if you've risk ranked, and then you've acted based upon your risk ranking, and you at some point, a year or 6 months or 2 years, review that or monitor it going forward.
Great, thank you. I think some people are being, unfortunately, misidentified in the chat, so I don't know what's going on with that. I might not have everybody's correct information here. But
I don't know what the problem is, but people are writing their name at the end. So we have a question, for instance, from João Elecki, who's a former CCO of Petrobras, Daniela Larson of Tishman Speyer, Felipe, you asked, Diana Nambuco with Charles River Associates. Glaucia, my dear partner, has a very good question. So I don't know, pick them up. Maria,
well, yes, there's so many. Yes, there is, and I want to stay on the ephemeral messaging because there are several questions that relate to the new CCO responsibility. I think we could take those together, group them together.
Right.
One of the questions that we're seeing here is regarding the monitoring of instant messaging. Is this compatible with GDPR? And this goes into the privacy issues, Tom, that you mentioned earlier.
And LGPD here in Brazil, which is very similar to GDPR.
So the monitoring of business conversations is consistent with both laws. Where companies are going to have trouble is obviously monitoring of personal private information, or PPI, and the ability to segregate that. And in countries subject to those robust data privacy laws, Brazil and the EU and the United Kingdom, companies are going to have to figure out a way that when they do look, they only look at the right thing. Unfortunately, I don't pretend to know what that answer is from a technical capability or technical requirement, but I am most familiar with GDPR, and it's going to be a huge problem in the United or in the EU going forward.
Thank you. As I mentioned, we have quite a few questions regarding the CCO responsibilities. So Ricardo Lemos, who is the supervisory board member for Fundação José Luiz Egídio, it's a hospital, Hospital Sabará, and his question relates to this new responsibility. And the question is, ultimately, does the responsibility still belong to the board?
Yes.
Or is this, it ultimately still belongs to the board, but it seems as though from what you were saying, it's almost a shared responsibility now.
It's shared, but the board is still above the senior executives. The ultimate responsibility with a corporation at the end of the day lies with the board.
Okay, and Renata Andrade asks a question here related to also the CCO issues that you brought up. And wanted you to comment about the general counsel or chief legal officer being the direct report for legal and compliance being sort of at the top of governance, right? Like, what is the reporting structure that's expected out of the new guidance from DOJ? We
have never had the Department of Justice specifically state who they believe the CCO should report to. So many companies have the structure that you have just described, where the chief compliance officer reports to the general counsel with a dotted line reporting to the board of directors, meaning they can pick up the phone and call someone on the board of directors. And many companies have a very successful compliance program with that structure. However, what this means is that CCO now legally may have more corporate responsibility than the person they're reporting to if they're reporting to the general counsel. And I think eventually it's going to be that compliance functions are going to be split out to their own function outside of reporting to any other corporate function. And number two is the CCO will report directly to the board. And I think but I've thought that for 15 years, and the Department of Justice has never said that.
Okay, thank you. And sort of staying along this topic, one of the questions that we have is from Diane Nabucco. And her question relates to examples of enforcement involving board members. And you know, with regard to the responsibility of the board and C-suite employees, can you provide some examples where we've seen enforcement against board members specifically?
Yes, I can. It's very easy. There are none. So where boards have gotten into trouble is not in enforcement actions. There has never been an enforcement action against a board member. I shouldn't say that. If a board member was involved in the bribery and corruption, there are some cases. They were smaller companies where the board members were active participants in the management too. So we have had a couple of those, but typically the board sits above senior management, has not been involved, had no knowledge of the bribery and corruption. Where boards get sued is there. It's always a civil action. It's usually in Delaware, and it's a shareholder action. So where shareholders bring a claim against the board for two different theories under the Caremark doctrine. So once again, Caremark is a requirement of oversight. Oversight means, number one, if a red flag gets to the board must take action. And that was actually the Boeing claim, because the Boeing board knew about the plane crashes and didn't do anything. The second is boards must put information systems in place to get the information to them. That's compliance. That's what a compliance program does, is provide information to a board. So that's called the information systems claim. And that was the Bluebell claim, because there was no food safety committee at the board. So there was no report of the listeria. And of course, the company had known about it for years and not done anything to clean up the plants. So when people started dying, that was not the first time the company knew about the listeria. The company had known about it previously, but the board had never set up an information system to get that information up to the board. So it's red flags and information systems. So that's how boards get into trouble. And the shareholder lawsuits are always cash payments. So in the case of Bluebell, it was $60 million. In the case of Boeing, I think it was $45 million, but they can be massive. And unfortunately, the example is Petrobras, United States, where there's a $3 billion payment on behalf of the board to the shareholders of the company for the U.S. branch's failures around the bribery and corruption scandal. So $3 billion, down to 60 billion or 60 million, that's still real money. And it's a cash payment. Now, I know the next question is, can we get insurance for that? Answer, yes. That's called D&O coverage, or directors and officers liability, and that protects officers. But here's a question I would pose to you where unfortunately I don't know the answer. What if your CCO is not an officer of the company? Are they covered under D&O coverage? I used to be an insurance coverage lawyer, and if it's not required by the policy, your insurance company is not your friendly insurance company. They're your insurance company, and they're governed by the four corners of the contract. It's called the four corners rule. If it's not specified, we have to pay, we don't pay. So that's sort of an open question at this point. There are many companies where a CCO may be considered a senior executive, yet not an officer as defined by the company. So if you're a CCO and you're listening, you might want to look into that.
A question just came in related specifically to the D&O issue, which is, doesn't D&O always make an exception for corruption practices in terms of coverage?
So D&O coverage generally will exempt out criminal conduct, but not always. And number one. Number two, we rarely see almost never boards engaging in criminal conduct. They may engage in a civil liability, which is what a shareholder action is, but there's always coverage for the civil side. So unless a board member is actually actively engaged in the bribery and corruption, there's probably going to be D&O coverage.
Tom,
Okay,
I have
thank
a
you.
question. Maria, sorry, it's still on
Sure.
the board issue. That's something that interests me a lot. And I had never thought of how in a lot of these FCPA cases, I've never seen any commentary as to whether a board was negligent or not. Do you think, Tom, that as the case law evolves, we will see more accountability for board members in terms of negligence or lack of proper oversight by what's happening in the company and are being reported to them?
I do not think we will see that in reported FCPA enforcement actions for the following reason. An FCPA enforcement action is a criminal penalty. And so if it's not criminal conduct, the DOJ has no need to talk about it, number one. Number two is they have to date always focused on the actual players involved or actors involved, and they haven't looked at really other areas. Occasionally, and I mean very rarely, they will say a line, something along the lines of corporate culture was not up to speed or something like that. But that doesn't necessarily mean boards. So we haven't seen that in the past. I doubt we're going to see that in the future. Where we are getting specific reported decisions which discuss detailed conduct are out of Delaware and these Delaware cases. And I can probably work with Isabella to get those to you, because I've also been studying this issue for a long time from the board perspective. And so I've got a pretty good analysis of the evolution of the Caremark doctrine, once again, from the board perspective.
Thanks.
If I may ask, oh, sorry, Cynthia. Go ahead.
No, I was just thanking him. Go ahead.
Okay. No, because there's so many questions. I'm feeling like I have a question that I want to ask you about the extraterritorial reach of all you're saying in terms of liability. What does it mean for the Brazilian CCO, the compliance officer who's sitting here and is part of this multinational company and sometimes has the oversight of a whole of Latin America? What do you think it is? Because I know it's very new for you to, but with
So
all your
let me then clarify, is this a Brazilian CCO who is the chief compliance officer for the country, for the entire company, or is it the CCO for LATAM who's reporting up to a corporate office in America where there's actually someone in compliance above him or her?
I think we want to know them all. In other words, there are people here who are for the country, for LATAM, and some of them who are kind of relocated here in Brazil, but they respond for the company also. There is a bit of everything with my clients, for example.
Okay, well, the first one's easy. If you're the CCO of a company subject to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, absolutely. CCO certification and potential liability under the McDonald's doctrine applies to you. If, however, you're the CCO of LATAM or Brazil or some other country in Latin America, and you're reporting to a US CCO, here's where I think the change is there's going to be an effective change. Number one, you need to understand your boss may be under some pretty great pressure and scrutiny. So you might want to think about that from the dynamics and what you do to support your boss perspective. Number two, the elevation of the compliance function in the corporation is going to be significant. Once again, you're still reporting up to someone in the United States, but the requirements of CCO visibility across the company are still going to be there for that US-based chief compliance officer, so that you, as the CCO in LATAM or Brazil, I think that elevation of your ability to have visibility across all corporate functions will be equally expand out as well.
Thanks, Tom. I think we want to try to get a couple more questions, and I know we're running short on time. Gabriel Queiroz had asked about the whistleblower, and specifically is asking about what the expectation or impact is for Latin American companies coming from the new AML Whistleblower Improvement Act. So that's one question, and then I'll throw the other one out. And I know we have limited time, so you may not be able to get to both. But we have another question from my colleague, Virginia Trivi, and she's asking if you can provide examples of companies that didn't maintain satisfactory compliance program after a monitorship was over, and what are some of the common pitfalls that we see with companies that have had difficulty in maintaining that satisfactory compliance program.
So let me start with that second one first. The CCO certification requirement came in last year, so we've had no companies fully complete their DPA 3-year period and then see a CCO certification and then see a failure. So there's no examples I can point you to. Number two, however, there was just Ericsson, the Swedish telecom company, after they signed their DPA, so in the middle of their deferred prosecution agreement, they had a huge additional corruption scandal. So the DOJ fined them another $200 million above the $1.1 billion from the original DPA and extended the deferred prosecution agreement term from 3 years to 5 years. So that's a pretty powerful example that even though it was during the middle of the DPA, what can happen if there's a failure. But there's no examples yet of CCO certification going forward. Unfortunately, we didn't even get to the whistleblower issue. And that's the biggest component of that, and I will include AML and FCPA whistleblowers, was found in the changes to the corporate enforcement policy, which were announced in January. And the significance is that companies are under now extraordinary pressure to quickly report or self-disclose if they want to get these now fabulous discounts available. And it's basically the need for speed. What that means, and this is to you, Isabella, but also to you, Maria, if a report comes in through the whistleblower line, through anonymous reporting, through your internal controls monitoring, somebody goes into their manager's office, somebody raises their hand and speaks up. What you guys have to do now is very quickly and very efficiently determine, is this a legal violation? And is this a legal violation that rises to the level of an FCPA or a money laundering violation? Because if it is, then you guys have to make the extraordinarily difficult decision, do we self-disclose with all of the ramifications of that? Or do we not self-disclose? Do we remediate whatever the violation of is and move forward? There's no legal requirement to self-disclose, but there are huge benefits potentially if you do. But the pressure now for the speed of a quick and efficient resolution of a whistleblower allegation, however it comes in, it could be you reading the newspaper, because that's an exact example of a case where it just raises a suspicion and you start to look into it. So your initial triage of the whistleblower complaint has become more important. Your initial, not your complete, but your initial internal investigation is now, you've picked up the phone and called Isabel. Now, the pressure's on her. Well, she's come back to you, and now you have to go to your board and you have to have that decision, that discussion with them. And then they have to make an incredibly difficult decision. They may bring in their own counsel to advise them at the board level. Well, nothing wrong with that. And, I'm a lawyer, so I'm all for that. But that's going to take time. And so the time we've all taken in the past to make a reasoned decision on what can be an extraordinarily difficult decision, that time frame has been compressed. Because if it comes out in the public arena somehow that this allegation has been made, you don't get credit for self-disclosure. So what it's done is puts pressure on, Maria, you and your team. It's put pressure on Isabel. The pressure at the board level has always been there, but now it's just the speed of making a decision to self-disclose or not. And so that's really it hasn't changed the dynamics of the whistleblower up to the point they blow the whistle. But for you and your team, it has changed that need for speed.
Wow. I used to go to Maria for these questions, Maria. Now you're my
I
client.
know.
I'm so sorry.
Change his turn.
We're running out of time. Cynthia, do you want to sort of last question or
Sure.
comment?
I think so. I think we're really pressed for time, so I hate to be the one to wrap up the event. I do think, Tom, that these webinars have become more and more interesting. I can't believe how much engagement we had today. So maybe for the next one, Isabel, we could think of either something centered around boards and maybe have a former or a current board member of a company maybe, participate. I'm really grateful for having had Maria here with us. I hadn't had the opportunity of connecting or meeting her in the past. I think you added tremendous value to the conversation, and it was really a pleasure to have you here with us, Maria. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
And my
Maria.
pleasure.
I can't thank you enough. And Tom also. Tom, the white paper on the McDonald's case will be distributed to everyone in Portuguese and English. And everyone who has not had a chance to have your question answered, please send it to us. We'll be happy to direct it to Tom and get you an answer by email or WhatsApp. But watch out for WhatsApp. my dear partner Glaucia had a question because she always says to me, "Don't use WhatsApp. Go to Teams." Will Teams have the same situation as WhatsApp or with the ephemeral messaging or no?
Are you asking me
Should we-
that?
Yes. Should we use Teams instead of WhatsApp? That's my question.
I don't know because I don't use Teams.
Oh, see, Glaucia, that's your answer. We have to find out. Anyway.
Before we go, I have to shamelessly plug this book.
Right.
It's a children's book I released. Being a compliance officer is awesome. And what it does is it's designed to explain to your children what you do as a compliance officer. It is the story of kids traveling across the universe to go to the rescue dog planet. That rescue dog planet is called Planet Potastic. And what happens when people try to engage in bribery and corruption to get the kids to build substandard buildings for the rescue dogs. So if you're into rescue dogs, I have 3. If you're into compliance officers, I obviously am into compliance officers. Or you just like a rollicking good story, it's only $20. It's on Amazon. You can either Google being a compliance officer is awesome, or put that in for the title, or put Thomas Fox or Tom Fox, and you can buy a best-selling book on what you do as a compliance officers, and your kids will understand.
And Tom, I do have one question about that. When I buy that for my kids, are they going to be calling me out when I try to bribe them?
It may open a whole new discussion. It's called consequence management.
Well, thank you so much, Tom.
Tom, thank you so much. We're planning to
Thank
have
you.
our next breakfast with Tom on June 1st, which is a Thursday. We these are a little flexible because we have to work on so many people's agendas. So this is probably going to be Thursday, June 1st. I always have to remember to thank our interpreter, Carlos. Thank you so much. And the marketing teams of both CRA and Azevedo Sette, who put this show, I call it a show, Tom. You're a showman together. Thank you all, and I'll see you the next time. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.